Hello there ladies and gentlemen, I'm Paul TX141 Walsh, welcoming you to an all new Ace in a Day gameplay for the arcade mode of War Thunder. Today's episode however is a special one, for today is my 24th birthday, i.e. the day of this video going up, and for it I thought I would treat you all to a review of the one plane I've been longing for in War Thunder ever since I first started playing this game. That is the F6F-5N Hellcat, my favourite plane in the Second World War, the Tier 3 Battle Rating 5.0 American Naval Fighter, also an American Naval Night Fighter. For our historical overview today, we're going to be focusing on the night fighter development of the F6F Hellcat, including this aircraft. Let's begin. In early 1942, the United States Naval Air Force, the USNAF, identified the need for night fighters and initiated the Project Affirm program to meet this need. Initially it was thought that Vought F4U Corsairs could be implemented with primitive airborne interception AI radar sets in order to meet the requirement. But in early 1943 the Corsair had not fulfilled the need, as Corsairs were still being operated primarily from land bases, not from carriers directly. The USNAF as a result asked Grumman, i.e. the developers behind the F6F Hellcat, to look into integrating AI radar into the F6F-3 design. By the spring of that year, a design featuring the AN/APS-4 radar set, as mounted in a pod in a rack under the right-hand wing, emerged. This design was designated the F6F-3E and flew for the first time on the 26th of June 1943. During the test flight, it was noted that the F6F would be the preferable night fighter due to the following. The plane had easier landing characteristics, well suited for night flying, and it was more stable as an overall gun platform compared to the Corsair. A total of 18 F6F-3Es were produced by September of 1943 as the radar equipment became available en masse. The F6F-3N followed in July of 1943, featuring the improved AN/APS-6 radar set as mounted in a bulbous pod on the leading edge of the outer right hand wing. A total of 205 F6F-3Ns were produced. The F6F-3 night fighters entered combat service by November of 1943 and were operating off of carriers by May of 1944. The success of the -3 as a night fighter led to the arrival of the night fighter variant of the F6F-3 successor, the F6F-5, in the summer of 1944. The night fighter, designated as the F6F-5N, featured an AN/APS-6 radar once again in the wing bulb mount on the right hand wing. But the plane was to also feature, compared to its predecessor night fighters, the uprated 2,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 10W water injection radial engine, a revised streamlined engine cowling, and an alternative wing that allowed for the installation of 4 12.7mm Browning machine guns with 400 rounds per gun, 2 to each wing, and 2 20mm A&M2 cannon, 225 rounds per gun, and 1 to each wing, whereby the cannon replaced the innermost 12.7mm machine guns of the 6 machine gun layout of the F6F-3. In fact, this mixed armament configuration is believed to have only been used on the late production runs of the F6F-5N, and on no other Hellcat variant or sub-variant. The intention of the boosted armament was to increase the first pass kill potential of the plane. A grand total of 1,434 F6F-5Ns were produced, seeing service mainly in US hands but also in British hands through to the end of the Second World War. And with our historical overview concluded, let us take a look at how the F6F-5N handles in War Thunder's arcade mode. Today's gameplay takes place on the frontline map Great River. For this we'll be using the following setup. Universal belts for our machine guns, reasoning being we intend to use our machine guns to soften up our foes and to provide lead for our stealth belts and our 20mm cannon. As a result, we're picking the second most powerful belt and one of the ones that offers a tracer component, whereby the most powerful belt is the stealth belt, and the difference between the two is that you switch out one of the incendiary rounds in the stealth belt for a tracer round in the universal belt. For our 20mm cannon, as already outlined, we're using the stealth belts, the most powerful on offer, consisting of 3 high explosive fragmentation incendiary shells backed up by a single practice shell. For our gun convergence, we'll be using 500 meters, reason being, as we'll go on to discuss throughout this review, the lack of overall parity in terms of outright pace between the F6F-5N and its opponents at its battle rating means that our foes will technically be at longer distances when we hope to kill them, so we will need a slightly longer gun convergence, hence the 500 meter choice. and for our fuel load we are picking the standard 30-minute fuel load to make it to the end of the game unscathed on fuel capacity. We begin our analysis then by discussing the 5N's climb rate. In short, the climb rate of this aircraft is consistent, but it is average at best. A large number of the battle rating 5.0 opponents you can face, including but not limited to the Yakovlev Yak 9P, the Spitfire F Mark 14E, the Messerschmitt 109 G2 and the Focke-Wulf 190 D9 will all be able to outclimb you by a significant margin, and we've seen that articulated on screen already. As a result, you should not expect to be in the first wave of climbers on your team, but instead in the backup wave, whereby you're going to use your teammates who have the superior climb rates to shield you from the opponents who have superior climb rates on the enemy team. Meanwhile, you get the opportunity to pursue the enemy bombers that are trying to stay up higher, such as the Dornier 217M above us, and we try to go dead vertical after them. But here we are playing against our weak climb rate, and this is an issue, as we're going to see very quickly as we start to score some hits. We start to also hit our stall speed of 125 km an hour, whereby we feel our stall effects as early as 160 km an hour, and our stall recovery is mixed, whereby if you've gone dead vertical into a stall as we've just seen, and let your speed drop below your stall speed, i.e. going below 100 km an hour in particular, your stall recovery takes a lot of time and a lot of altitude away from you, and until you hit approximately 300 km an hour, your elevator will become unresponsive. However, if you take a gradual climb and stall out gradually, i.e. 50 degrees or less, your stall recovery is very nice and very quick, meaning you lose minimal altitude, and we're going to see that in our second attempt at the Dornier 217. We hit our stall, but fortunately we can recover quickly because we took a shallower angle. Now the Dornier 217 has taken a significant amount of damage, and we're going to make a third attempt, but we can see how the outright pace of the 5N is not enough to bring the Dornier down. If we had been flying the likes of the Griffon Spitfire, either Mark 14E, this would have been a done and dusted effort, or the Dornier would have woken up and dived by now, simply because we'd have the greater engine power or the greater performance ratio, i.e. the torque, comparing our engine power to the mass of the aircraft. And we have to consider the fact that the F6F-5N is a naval fighter at the end of the day. This plane is not suited to go to speeds in excess of 700 km an hour, or should we say suited or expected, compared to a number of its battle rating contemporaries which are land-based fighters, such as the Griffon Spitfire, the Messerschmitt 109G, you get the picture. So this is going to be a slower aircraft on the whole, but where it makes up for that is in the fact that it's a consistent aircraft, whereby we're going to find it's a jack of all trades. It has a little bit of everything, and also it's a highly durable aircraft. We're not going to see that too much here, but take my word for it. You can take a lot of 20mm cannon shells in this plane, and as long as they're not hitting the wingtip, for example, successively, this plane will keep on flying. Of course, if you are hit by the likes of 37mm high explosive shell from a Yakovlev Yak 9P, your wing's going to come flying off. That's the same with most aircraft when a 37mm shell hits it. Now, having dealt with that Dornier 217 by forcing them down to lower altitude, although it took out one of our bases in the process, we're now diving down a little bit from roughly 6,000 metres, and that is because we want to drop the altitude of our engagements. The overall altitude performance of the 5N is such that it performs very well and at its maximum between 2,000 and 5,000 metres altitude. As soon as you creep above 5,000 metres, you will notice a significant drop in overall controllability and also engine performance, especially when you get to 6,000 metres. But unfortunately, a Focke-Wulf 190A4 lofting around at approximately 7,000 metres altitude and now gunning for us poses a problem. If we're going to engage them, we need time to do so, and we need the room to drop a little bit of altitude, so we've raised our altitude once more to approximately 5,900 metres altitude, and now we're going into a gradual dive. This 190 is set on taking us down, but we're going to use our high speed manoeuvrability to force them to overshoot. We're getting ready to turn underneath, and as they close in just shy of a kilometre away from us, if just under now, we're going to snap underneath them in a sharp turn, and cut back over the top of them once they've tried to take a shot at us. Here we go. Cutting over the top and rolling back over. The A4 tries to go dead vertical to get away, but we're right on their 6. And as soon as we are on their 6 and they try to get away, we can open fire with our armament, which will shred them to pieces. Already pumping in the rounds, we've taken off their left-hand wingtip, and as they roll around at dead on 500 metres, we pick up our first kill. And it's a good thing we raised the altitude of that fight when we did, because notice the Spitfire F Mark 9 climbing up underneath us? Well, they're dead on their stall. If we'd taken a different approach, i.e. we'd continue to drop the fight and not climb back up, we would have been a piece of dead meat. So 2 kills in the bag. We now level out and look around and see no other threats coming towards us. In the meantime, we notice a Dornier 217 that spawned in, and also a Messerschmitt 109 that's climbing up very rapidly. Now we're not going to try and take the Messerschmitt 109 on head on because we need the time and space to do so. We need to isolate them. So instead we're going to climb over the top and try and bait them to come up and stall out underneath us. As whilst they do have a superior climb rate and greater overall acceleration in the vertical, we have the energy in terms of both kinetic and potential energy, high speed and altitude, to be able to stay over the top. So we have to plan our engagements accordingly, and that is something you need to get used to in the 5N. The fact that you need to try and guess the energy states of your foes at all points, and you need to be pretty accurate in your approximations, otherwise you will get ripped apart rather rapidly. But as we look below us, we've got 2 Spitfires climb out, or at least one in particular, so we get ready to swoop over the top. It's a Spitfire Mark 2B. As they begin to stall out, we take an extended approach on them just in case another Spitfire climbs up towards us, and we pick up a nice critical hit, severely damaging the right hand wing. We think about snapping around, but then decide we're right over the top of the enemy spawn. It'll be ill-advised, as we will not be able to pull the distance if anyone tries to climb up after us if we continued on our path to attack the Spitfire once again. And we also picked a very poor attacking angle for our second pass. But with the ammunition we used and our overall armament, the first pass kill should be achieved. That is the wonderful thing about the armament on this plane. You will usually pick up your kill in your first pass, or do enough damage to pick up a critical, which will result in the kill in the end, especially when you shoot at your Convergence. So as the Spitfire casually drifts off towards the edge of the map, ripped to pieces, we notice the Messerschmitt 109 from earlier now attacking our friendly P8 in the distance, and we're going to make our way over to intercept. But here lies the problem, which is the 5N, as mentioned earlier, does not have the outright pace to be able to intercept enemy aircraft. It can in the long haul, as we gain a little bit of altitude to make sure we've got some space to manoeuvre against the Messerschmitt 109 if they decide to go 1 versus 1, but notice how long it is going to take us to get to the Messerschmitt 109. If we were in another Messerschmitt 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 D9 or the Griffin Spitfire, we'd be there a lot faster. And this is something you need to manage and something you need to expect. Your games at times will be slow, simply because whilst you are in technically a fast aircraft, i.e. this plane can get to speeds in excess of 600 km an hour with altitude and with time, it's not going to be as fast in terms of straight line acceleration as its opponents. And this also means that it's very difficult to chase down foes who are trying to run from you, or alternatively escape those who are chasing after you, as you are one of the slowest fighters at your battle rating, although not as slow as the likes of the F6F-5N Otsu, a comparable aircraft to this plane, as we finally pick up our third kill on the Spitfire we cut apart earlier. And this Messerschmitt 109G seems oblivious to our presence, but they've finally woken up as we try to get in a little bit closer. We continue to close in because we want to see if they want to turn fight with us. Sometimes Messerschmitt 109 pilots do want to do that, as they feel they may be the superior aircraft, as they try to loop up over the top of us, and then they decide to switch, levelling themselves out before reversing the way of their climb. Before they're going to loop, but instead they push down on the elevator. We stay right on the 6, having damaged their tail, snapping a couple more rounds, well inside our Convergence, meaning that a lot of our ammunition is going to actually miss. We've also damaged their left hand flap. As the G2 Trop starts to waft across the skies, making themselves unpredictable, we're just going to provide a little bit of surveillance and keep monitoring their position, as we expect them to loop up once more. But as we can see, they're not going to do so, so we decide to hold altitude above the cloud layer. Now note here how we were accelerating rather nicely in the dive, and that is one of the key things about the 5N as well. It does have the ability to pursue its foes in a dive, unless they are in the likes of a P47M15 Thunderbolt, the same battle rating as you of course. They are not going to be able to get away from you rapidly in the dive, which as a result means you can pursue your foes when they may not expect you to do so. But straight line acceleration is a key weak point, although you do have respectable acceleration from your stall speed to 450 km an hour, and you can extend this with more emergency power to 500 km an hour, so you can build up a lot of speed with time. But sometimes time is not always on your side, and we're just monitoring this Messerschmitt 109 for the time being. Unfortunately, by not getting the kill in the first place, we have to monitor them, and that is going to consume a lot of our time in this match, as we force them to go down once again. We are hoping in the end they'll become frustrated with us lingering over the top of them, and they'll decide to go for the head on, as we should be able to bring them down even though they've got the nose mounted armament. We look over and see the Messerschmitt 109 is again getting ready to assail to altitude, and we're preparing ourselves to take them on. So in the meantime, what about the ideal speed range for this aircraft? Well, its control surfaces are at their maximum between 300 and 600 km an hour. We were talking about controllability at high speeds earlier on, and we need to come back to it, as we look towards a Heinkel 111 and at the same time also monitoring the Messerschmitt 109. And we decide, whilst we could go for the Heinkel, that Messerschmitt 109 is ready for the head on now, they're prepared and we need to bring them down. Then we can take on the Heinkel. Here we go at long distance, opening fire at 1.5 km, we get our shots in on the target and we pick up our kill. Kill number 4. as the Messerschmitt 109 burns out of the sky. We now snap round to the Heinkel 111 and we can see how our manoeuvrability with speed, in the speed range we just mentioned, but particularly between 400 and 550 km an hour, is at its maximum as we quickly change direction 180 degrees. So, when we talked earlier about controllability with speed in a dive, against that Focke-Wulf 190A4, are there any lock-up thresholds as we tear apart the Heinkel 111 gradually? Yes, there are multiple. Now in general, when we look at all three control axes, i.e. your elevator, your roll rate, or your ailerons we should say, and also your rudder, all three control surfaces are good in general, as we take off the tail control of this Heinkel 111 H3 and we decide to leave them, jamming one of our guns as well, and also taking a light smattering of damage in return. But as you go to the high speeds you will experience lockups. First, with your roll rate, whereby your roll rate begins to lock up at 600 km an hour, and by the time it hits 750 km an hour, the roll rate lockup is maximised, taking away 50% of your controllability. You also lose 50% with your rudder, but from the speed range of 700 to 800 km an hour. And in the case of your elevator, that locks up very late and takes away 50% of your performance from 750 km an hour to 800 km an hour. So only in cases where you are performing with extreme speed are you going to experience any significant loss of controllability. But even then, it's only half of your controllability, so you can account for it, or at least against most foes you can, unless they are the most manoeuvrable. More on that a little bit later. And now we're coming back to our problem from earlier, the concept of outright pace. This Messerschmitt 109 is the same pilot we just shot down in the head-on, i.e. with the other Messerschmitt 109. Now the problem is, that Messerschmitt 109 has the pace, has the acceleration, the straight line speed, you name it, to be able to just head out to the edge of the map and essentially force us to pursue them for an extremely long period of time. And whilst we are putting a lot of altitude on our side right now, bleeding a number of our kinetic energy, the issue is that Messerschmitt 109 in the long haul will be able to just simply frustrate us, get to the same altitude as us, if not higher, and then gain the upper hand and take us on in a one-to-one that will be disadvantageous to ourselves. And this means we could right now spend a lot of time chasing them. As this game is already coming to its end, we can see that our team has gained the upper hand, and the Heinkel 111 without tail control has dropped its bombs on one of our bases, but after that the pilot's going to bail out because they've got nothing left in terms of controllability on their tail, so we did our job there. And I've found that whilst I could have featured a number of games which were more intense compared to this one, this goes to highlight the true nature of the 5N, which is, unless you can keep your foes within arm's reach at all times or keep them entertained on your aircraft, if you get a foe that decides to simply use their speed, use their raw pace to gain altitude, gain distance from you, you really are at their whim, they're not going to be at your whim, and it means a lot of your foes can control their engagements against you. But if you keep up the pace on them, keep up the initiative, that's when you can take control. And that's the difference between this engagement with the Messerschmitt 109, which is never going to happen, versus the engagement with the Messerschmitt 109 from earlier. We got onto their 6, we used our strong dive speed acceleration to stay with them, we harassed them whenever they tried to get to altitude, forced them into that head-on, and eventually got them. But here, the Messerschmitt 109 will instead gain that position we had over them earlier. Now whilst we're loitering around, we decide to show the weaker controllability of the 5N at speeds in excess of 800 km an hour by trying to dive after an F6F-5N. And as we can see here, our dive speed is actually quite high and quite respectable, pushing above 850 km an hour gradually. And indeed, your dive speed hits approximately 900 km an hour if I remember correctly, if not a little bit higher. There we go, it seems to maximise out at approximately 913 km an hour. We cut down on here on the F6F-5N, but unfortunately we just cannot get the shot on target, and they are a highly manoeuvrable aircraft and technically our historical adversary, i.e. the F6F-3 was made to combat the F6F-5N. So as a result we can see how our more manoeuvrable opponent was able to gain the upper hand in that short period of time, but we just broke away. And in terms of energy conservation, the 5N does not have the best energy conservation in the vertical. Boom and zoom passes are going to bleed a significant amount of energy, whereby if you dive down from say 5,000 meters, hit your maximum dive speed and then you go straight back up into the vertical, you will lose at least 300 meters altitude, if not more, heading towards 500 meters altitude. But in the horizontal in turn fighting, you actually retain a nice amount of speed. Just don't let your speed drop below 300 km an hour, otherwise your turn circle becomes incredibly exaggerated, much like the position of that LA5 there as we cut them apart for our 7th and final kill. So that really brings us on to the concluding point, and that is, how is the F6F-5N in a standard turn fight, i.e. one where you're fighting someone on a level altitude, level playing field? Well, the turn circle of this plane in its ideal speed range, as discussed earlier, that 300 to 600 km/h mark, is roughly equivalent to the likes of a Messerschmitt 109G or an LA-5, meaning this plane is able to turn fight with a good number of planes. Spitfires and Zeros, however, will be able to gain the upper hand very quickly, and that extends to the likes of Typhoons who use their landing flaps. Although you have to remember that your combat flaps and indeed your landing flaps are quite impressive on this aircraft and will bleed a considerable amount of speed for you, allowing you to tighten your turn. Just don't turn fight below 275 km/h in particular, otherwise your turn circle is going to become exasperated. But due to the balanced and good overall nature of all three control surface domains on this plane, you can normally gain the upper hand against any foe. And we're going to see here that Messerschmitt 109's obsession with killing us is going to essentially have wasted the entirety of their match, whereby they dive after us, but it's not going to be enough. Where we can just go to a higher speed, not picking up too much speed, and turn underneath them. And in the end they decide they do not have a clear shot on target and decide to break away. As they do so, the game comes to its end, and we can now take a look at the post-game stats. With our 7 kills, we're able to pick up 31,340 silver lions and take away 3,396 research points. To defeat the 5N in a given matchup, I can recommend one or two approaches. The first, and this is for the majority of the planes around the battle rating of 5.0, is to use your superior climb rate and straight line acceleration to frustrate the 5N pilot as they try to climb after you and stall out in your wake, at which point you can ham head over or split S over and cut them to pieces. A number of planes can do this, but to name a couple, the J2M3, the Spitfire LF Mark 9, the I-185 M71, the F6F-1 Bearcat, and the Focke 490 D9. The alternative approach, if you're feeling a little bit more daring, is to engage this aircraft in a turn fight, especially below 2,000 meters altitude, where the plane loses a significant chunk of its engine performance, much like how it does above 5,000 meters altitude. And if you can force the fight to go below 300 km an hour, you'll be laughing, as the turn circle of the 5N becomes exacerbated at lower speeds. Planes such as the A6M5 Otsu and the Yakovlev Yak 9P and the Spitfire LF Mark 9 once again will excel in this regard. But by avoiding such circumstances today, hopefully we have demonstrated how the F6F-5N Hellcat is quite the all-rounder and provides a significant alternative to the more speed-orientated planes at its battle rating within the American tech tree. Most notably the P-47 M15, Thunderbolt, and on top of that the F4U-1C Corsair, whereby this plane is reliant on the pilot knowing that it can do a little bit of everything, so long as its opponents do not use their superior speed and climb rates to frustrate it, and then the pilot needs to recognise that and work around it, or just simply give up on that engagement and come back to face the foe frustrating them another day, albeit under disadvantageous circumstances if your opponent knows what they're doing. But still, the F6F-5N makes a welcome addition to any hangar in my opinion, and goes to show that even on this old formula you can still make it work, especially with the uprated armament compared to its predecessor, the F6F-5, back at a battle rating of 3.0 if I remember correctly. The only problem at the battle rating of 5.0 is that a number of your opponents now are going to be advancing into a much higher speed era, and this may leave you feeling a little bit old. And so I've been TX141, and if you've enjoyed this video, why not leave a like, comment or subscribe for future War Thunder videos on my channel. But until next time, ladies and gentlemen, take care and good luck in the skies.